And how do you feel about prepping the meat? As somebody who is consuming only meat, to me, that would be a big concern. If you're out barbecuing every day and charring your meat versus, putting it in the oven and baking a steak. Yeah, I'm not somebody that cooks a ton of meat, so I don't have like a full array of different ways of cooking it. But how do you think about that from a health perspective?
Oh, well, just your skills in cooking are going to increase dramatically when the only thing you cook is meat. You're going to get pretty damn good at cooking meat. So, like, my steaks. I'm not ashamed to say that. The steaks I make are better than any steakhouse I've ever been to. I've no problem saying that. And But that's how I prepare it. I age. I have my fridge is only meat, right? So it's a dedicated meat fridge. I can age these things. I have them aging. I have them wet aging. I have them dry aging. I have individual steaks cut up and lightly salted on drying racks, as I learned from watching an Alton Brown video. He was a chef, a celebrity chef sort of guy. And you just salt it, put it on drying rack so it's not touching anything, so air can circulate around all of it, and it sort of dries it out a bit, and the salt gets into it, and it just makes the browning so much better. It has this crispy, crunchy crust. It almost, if you age it long enough, it almost tastes like chocolate. It's just this deep, rich, lovely taste. And so, and then I know exactly how to cook it, exactly how long to get exactly the rare to medium rare that I want, and with a nice, crispy crust on the outside. And so I'm happy to cook on my. I much prefer cooking. That's another thing too. You save a lot of money not going out to eat, not going out to restaurants all the time, because the food I cook is better. And I have people come over for dinner sometimes, and they're just like, "Oh my God, you eat this every night?" And I was like, "Yeah, I do." It's like, "Well, no wonder you don't go out. I would never leave the house, if I was eating this every day." And so it makes a big difference. So as far as concerns about cooking and charring it and things like that, not too concerned. The studies that looked at the you know potential harmful effects of charring meat, were done in lab animals with thousands of times the amount of these chemicals that than you would find in like a burnt steak, right? So it's not we're not comparing apples to apples, right? So you're looking at something in a much higher proportion. So we've been cooking meat. There's very good archaeological evidence um, that we've been cooking meat and possibly in ovens for at least 790,000 years, right? So 500,000 years before Homo sapiens existed, we were cooking meat. And some people think it's actually much longer than that, probably like 1.5 million years we've been cooking meat. So we've been cooking meat for a very long time. Whatever's in cooked meat and burnt meat is something we are well adapted to at this point. It's not like the agricultural revolution, where it's only about 8,000 years ago that we've been faced with this stuff. This is 500,000 years before we even showed up, and so we evolved on cooked meat and potentially charred meat, so on open fire. And I'm sure they got very good at it too, but I'm sure there was some burnt, charred bits on there as well.
A typical steak, though, would you sear it inside, like on a pan, and then put it in the oven, or are you a fan of using the barbecue? I'm sure there's a lot of
Okay,
different
so
variety in the way you're cooking, because again, I'm
yeah.
guessing, trying to make it taste different day to day. But what does a typical cooking of a steak look like?
Well, I usually do things pretty consistently because I found something that works and gets the results that I really like. So, I'm not worried about like switching things up and like, oh, I want something different, because, most people get tired of what they're eating if they're eating the same thing, because it's nutrient deficient and your body gets used to those nutrients and says, okay, no, we got enough of those. We need this other thing now. And so those other things taste better. Whereas a steak is complete nutrition. So it has everything you need in the proportion that you need it. So as long as you're hungry, it's always going to taste good. And so I even catch myself doing this now, where where I get like, I'll cook a steak and I'm hungry and it's been a long day, and I cut into it. The first bite, I will audibly say like, man, that's good. And I'll say every time, and so I didn't even catch myself. I'm like, this is ridiculous. I've been doing this for 6 years, like, but it is every single time. It's like, my God, that's good, because that first hit, my body really wants those nutrients. I've cooked it in a very good way. So it's just like, this is amazing. And so I'm always happy to eat the same thing all the time, because that's what my body wants. And normally, if it's just like just a normal steak, like boneless steak, I'll cook that in the pan. I'll use actually probably about a centimeter of fat, so like tallow, and or duck fat or whatever. And usually it's just the drippings from the previous steaks, and it's almost sort of partially deep frying this stuff, and it'll get that crispy, crunchy exterior like you would if you were, frying this sort of thing, deep frying this thing. And so I get all, because I make like big, thick, like 3-inch thick steaks. And so I'll, brown and crisp all the edges as well. And then I get each side and be all brown and crispy. And usually I just do it on the pan. I don't then finish it off in the oven. I like things less cooked in general, but, like a rare, medium rare, like rare to medium rare, more like seared and pretty much raw in the middle. I like. One thing I will do is I'll take a steak out in the morning and I'll just leave it on the counter to come up. If you do this like an hour, 20 minutes or whatever before, there's no point. It's not gonna warm up in time. It takes hours and hours and hours to warm up to room temperature. But if you do have the time and you set that out in the morning, you're able to let it sit for 10 hours, it will come up to room temperature, and then you can just have it just cooks differently, Whereas if you come up with a big 3-inch thick steak, you put that on the pan, it'll be all crunchy and brown on the outside. It will be cold still in the middle, and so that's something you would probably want to finish up in the oven. But I'm generally too lazy. I just want to eat it, and so I don't do that. I just eat it more raw in the middle. But if you let it come to room temperature, then it will start cooking that in the middle as well. And so it's just 4 minutes. For a big thick steak, I might do 3 minutes or 4 minutes on each side, possibly 5 minutes on each side, and that usually gets a good rare to medium rare with really nice crust on the outside. And if it's a big tomahawk with a big bone, that's not going to fit in the pan, so I'll do that on the grill.
So you mentioned something there that really caught my attention, the fact that a steak is a complete meal, complete nutrition. And we know 99% of the time you're having steak as your solo meat of the day. Do you feel like that other 1% is essential for getting a diversity of nutrients? It doesn't sound like it, but I really want to hammer home this point. So if you were told for the rest of your life you could only eat that steak, it sounds like you feel like you'd be getting complete nutrition having that exact same meal every day.
Yeah,
Only.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, steak is everything, So, I think that even having a bit of eggs or chicken or pork or something like that I have is probably less good than the steak, and probably knocking me back a bit. And that's usually why it's 99% of what I eat is steak, because maybe I'll have some pork bellies or eggs, or if I can only really get bacon and eggs at the hospital if I wanted to eat during the day. And so I'll get like 10 eggs and like 6 big long strips of bacon, like full strips. Like down here they do that. I mean, it's like a foot long or more of bacon. And so that's I'll do that for a few days, and I'm like, I'm feeling good, but I'm not feeling my best. And so I just really focus on just eating beef. And after sort of 5 days of just beef, I'm like, yeah, okay, this is how I'm supposed to feel. So yeah, no, I think it's that 1% that's actually dropping me back a bit, as opposed to the 99% of beef. So yeah, if I could just eat beef my whole life, I absolutely would. If I just had some land out and some cows and maybe some sheep, but I don't know if I'd even want them. But maybe some goats, and goats are fun. And then just like wild game and just fresh beef. I think that would be it for me. I'd be happy.
Some more nuance on that steak. You mentioned a number of times fatty meat. So are there certain steaks that you would totally avoid? And when it comes to eating steak, a lot of them have like that, fat around the side. Do you cut any of that away? It doesn't sound like it, but I'm just curious. And then the salt piece, is that for flavor? Is that for getting some minerals? I assume for flavor, but again, elaborate on all that.
Yeah, so I never trim the fat. I always want all the fat, and I usually in Australia it's very difficult because it has to go through the abattoir. You don't have as much of a input on it. You can't talk to the butcher, say, hey, can you not trim all this stuff on it? Because most of the time they're not trimming any of it off. It's just coming to them already trimmed, and so sometimes they will, but you can. And so sometimes you can just say, hey, don't trim anything off. Um, so yeah, no, I never trim anything off. I mean, when I sort of was getting into this, I understood that fat wasn't bad for me, and cholesterol had been used as a scapegoat for sugar and other processed garbage. Um, but it was so ingrained in me that since I was a kid, it was just like fat's bad, fat's bad, fat's bad. So even though I understood and I'd seen the research and the studies and all these sorts of things and historical documentation about the fraud perpetrated on vilifying cholesterol and fat when it was more likely sugar, um, I was still trimming the fat off. And I caught myself once. I'm like, what am I doing? Like, I trust the research. I believe the data. The fat's good for me. Eat the damn fat. And so I had to like tell myself that, but it was still like, it was this physical repulsion of just eating fat, because my whole life was just like, that's bad, that's bad, that's bad. And so I associated this texture and flavor with something that was bad for me. So I had to sort of recondition myself. And so I cut off a sliver of fat because I couldn't just eat the fat. I cut off a piece of it and put it with a more lean piece of meat, eat those together. And I'm like, okay, well, that tastes good together in that combination, like a marbled steak would taste good. And I started doing that a little more. Then I could have a little more fat with the meat and a little more fat. And now I just eat butter, and I mean, it's delicious. So, I do go for the fattier cuts of meat. I generally look at something and I go for the fat content. I want more fat on the meat. And so I just go gravitate towards those cuts. They're generally the cheaper cuts anyway, except for ribeye. That's obviously a more designer cut. But like chuck, brisket, those are very cheap. And usually ground beef, if it's a fattier content, it's cheaper. And so that works for me. For the salt, yeah, that's purely flavor profile for me. I don't think you need it. There's plenty of people that don't. There's thoughts that we only started really using salt, mineral salt and sea salt. After the agricultural revolution, we started eating things, not in keeping with our biology, and then we needed to change things up a bit and maybe add in some mineral salts. But there are a number of different, carnivores that don't use salt and don't salt their meat, and they actually think it's better to not do that. They feel better without it. I've not eaten salt, for a month at a time before, and I felt fine, and there was no issues. I wasn't getting cramps. I wasn't getting any neurological issues, which is what you get with low sodium, and there wasn't an issue. So I do it just because of that drying technique that I use, where I take the steak and I'll put some salt on it, and that'll just sort of help dry it out. So I find that just helps the drying process a bit, and it sort of gets a better sort of crust. And so I've done that for that reason. But you can certainly do it without that. You can put it on the drying racks and just let it dry out on its own. You don't have to put salt on it. But as I go, I'm using less and less and less salt as I go anyway. So it's just been a natural sort of progression to use less and less salt. But no, I don't think you need it. I don't think you have to have it. I think you get everything you need just from the meat. And I've practiced that myself and done that myself. And I know a number of people that have been doing carnivore diet consistently far longer than I have, 20, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, not using any sort of salt. And, so I don't think you have to. That's just purely for, flavor preference for me.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
No animal eats the variety of plants that we do. And I think that's causing and driving most of the modern non-communicable chronic diseases that we face these days. It is the complete elimination diet because it gets rid of everything you